My daughter-in-law threw my battered suitcase onto the wet concrete of the porch. She stood in the doorway, blocking the warmth of the house, and told me I had two choices: hand over the password to my entire retirement savings, or get out and sleep on the street. I looked at my own son, who stood silently behind her, and I made my choice. I walked away into the freezing rain. But what they did not know was that the man they thought was a broke, helpless old retired mechanic was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. And trust me, I never regretted it. My name is Wade Callahan. I am 69 years old, and for my entire life I believed in the power of hard work and family. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed my daughter-in-law's arrogant illusion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned and not demanded. Now, let me take you back to that rainy Tuesday afternoon. The cold drizzle was soaking right through my old flannel jacket, chilling me to the bone. Meredith, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, stood under the dry awning of the front door. She wore her expensive designer yoga clothes and held a steaming mug of artisanal coffee. Her eyes were completely cold and devoid of any human empathy. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my old leather suitcase, resting in a muddy puddle. "You have exactly 5 minutes, Wade," she snapped. "Either you write down the login details for your $200,000 retirement account, or you are out of this house for good. We are not running a charity for stubborn old men." Her voice was loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but she did not care at all. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to break me down so I would hand over the only money she thought I had left in the world. I stood there, feeling the cold rain on my face, and looked past her. I looked past Meredith's arrogant smirk and fixed my eyes on the hallway behind her. My son Kendrick was standing near the staircase. He was 35 years old, a grown man by any standard, but right then, he looked like a terrified little boy. He kept his head down, staring intensely at the hardwood floor, as if the wood grain held the answers to the universe. He would not meet my eyes, not even for a second. The betrayal cut much deeper than the freezing rain ever could. Kendrick was my flesh and blood. When his mother Gwen passed away 2 decades ago, I worked double shifts as a licensed electrician and plumber just to make sure he never went to bed hungry. I saved every extra dollar I earned, denying myself any comforts. Years later, when he wanted to buy a home to start his life with Meredith, I took the cash I had bled for and paid the entire down payment on this exact house. I put the deed in his name because I trusted him implicitly. I wanted him to feel proud. I wanted him to be the man of his own castle. I willingly took the damp, unfinished basement as my room, telling myself I was just helping the younger generation get a head start in a tough world. But Meredith never saw my sacrifice. She only saw an old black man taking up space in a house she believed was hers by absolute right. She hated my worn-out work boots by the door. She hated the smell of my dark roast coffee in the morning. And most of all, she hated that I would not blindly hand over my life savings to fund her luxury lifestyle. Kendrick finally shifted his weight and mumbled something under his breath. He said, "Dad, just give her the password. It is for our future. You live under our roof anyway. You owe us." The words tasted like poison coming from his own mouth. He was completely blinded by his desperate desire to please a woman who measured his worth solely by his bank account. He stood there, letting his wife throw his own father out into a storm just to finance her delusions of grandeur. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not drop to my knees and beg for mercy. Decades of facing discrimination and surviving the hardest parts of this country had taught me one vital lesson. Anger makes you sloppy, but silence makes you dangerous. I looked at Meredith. Her arms were crossed over her chest, waiting for my surrender. She expected me to break down crying. She expected the helpless old man to realize he had no other options and hand over the keys to his meager financial kingdom. Instead, I slowly reached down and grabbed the wet handle of my suitcase. I adjusted my flat cap, stood up perfectly straight, and looked her right in the eye with a terrifying calmness. My absolute silence seemed to unnerve her deeply. Her confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She took a step forward and raised her voice, trying desperately to regain her authority over the situation. "Do not think you can come crawling back here when you get hungry," she sneered loudly. "Do not expect a single dime from Kendrick to pay for some cheap motel. You are on your own, Wade. You made your choice." I looked at Kendrick one last time. He finally looked up, his eyes wide with a sickening mix of guilt and panic. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to stop me, but Meredith shot him a sharp glare that silenced him instantly. I did not say a single word to either of them. I turned my back to the house I had paid for and began to walk down the wet driveway. The sound of the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind me echoed loudly through the quiet suburban street. The deadbolt clicked into place with a heavy thud. They truly thought they had just thrown out the trash. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. I walked steadily down the sidewalk, completely ignoring the heavy rain soaking through my clothes. I did not look back even once. I reached the corner of the street just out of sight from the large living room window of the house. I stopped by a stop sign and waited patiently. Less than a minute later, a sleek black Lincoln Town car pulled around the corner. The thick tires hissed softly against the wet asphalt as the luxury vehicle smoothly pulled up right in front of me. The rear door opened immediately, and a man in a sharp tailored suit stepped out into the rain, holding a large black umbrella. He walked quickly over to me, took my wet suitcase with one hand, and held the umbrella over my head with the other to shield me from the storm. He gave a deep, respectful bow. "Mr. Callahan," he said in a calm, highly professional tone, "your lawyer is waiting for you at the hotel. Everything has been prepared exactly as you requested." I nodded silently, stepped into the warm, luxurious leather interior of the car, and watched my old neighborhood fade away in the rearview mirror. The smooth ride in the Lincoln Town car was a silent transition between two entirely different worlds. Within 20 minutes, the sleek vehicle glided to a halt beneath the massive, illuminated awning of the downtown Ritz Hotel. The driver quickly opened my door, shielding me from the relentless rain. I stepped onto the pristine marble floor of the lobby, leaving the cold reality of my son's house far behind me. The hotel staff greeted me with respectful nods, completely unfazed by my damp flannel jacket and worn-out work boots. They knew exactly who I was. I was escorted directly to the private elevator reserved for VIP guests. The doors slid open on the top floor, revealing the entrance to the presidential suite. I stepped inside the massive double doors, and the stark contrast between this opulent space and the damp, unfinished basement I had been living in for the past 3 years hit me instantly. The suite featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline, a massive mahogany dining table, and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the plush carpets. Sitting at the head of the table was my longtime financial attorney, Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan was 55 years old, with sharp, observant eyes and an impeccable navy blue suit. He had managed my secretive corporate entities for over a decade. Spread out across the polished wood in front of him were several thick financial dossiers. He stood up immediately, pouring me a cup of hot black coffee from a silver carafe. He did not ask why I was soaking wet. He already knew the day had come. I took off my soaked jacket, handing it to an attendant, and sat down in the luxurious leather chair opposite him. Jonathan adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a grim expression. "We have a serious situation, Wade," he said, in a tone devoid of any pleasantries. I brought the coffee to my lips, taking a slow sip. "Tell me everything," I replied. Jonathan slid a heavy manila folder across the table, opening it to reveal a stack of banking statements, highlighted in bright red ink. "That old retirement account of yours," he began, leaning forward. "The one with $200,000 in it. The account Meredith just threw you out into the rain for." I nodded slowly. It was a decoy account I had set up years ago to receive my modest Social Security and pension checks. It was meant to maintain my facade as a simple retired tradesman, ensuring Kendrick and Meredith never suspected the tens of millions I had quietly accumulated in private trusts. Jonathan tapped his pen against the paper. "The balance is zero, Wade. The account was completely drained exactly 2 months ago." I stared at the numbers printed on the page, feeling a sudden sharp jolt of confusion. "That is impossible," I said firmly. "I have not authorized a single transfer from that bank in over 5 years. I do not even carry the checkbook for it anymore." Jonathan pulled a clear plastic sleeve from the bottom of the pile and placed it directly in front of me. "This is a copy of the wire transfer authorization form, submitted in person at the local branch," he explained. "The bank released the funds because the individual who presented it possessed your original birth certificate, your Social Security card, and a signed power of attorney." I looked closely at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a clumsy, hesitant imitation of my handwriting. The loops were too tight, and the pressure of the pen was entirely wrong. Whoever had forged my signature had practiced, but they were rushing, fueled by desperation. I knew exactly where my personal documents were kept. They were in a locked metal box, hidden under my old cot in the basement. Only one person on earth besides me knew where the key was hidden, my own son. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Meredith did not just kick me out to get my password. They had already stolen the money. She was demanding the login details today simply to humiliate me and to solidify her absolute dominance in that house, knowing full well the vault was already empty. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of their crime, my phone buzzed violently in my damp pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Kendrick. I opened the message and read the block of text. The words on the screen were so pathetic and spineless that they made my stomach churn with disgust. "Dad, I am so sorry," the message read. "I could not say anything in front of Meredith while she was kicking you out. The truth is, I already took the money from your retirement account 2 months ago. I had to forge your signature on the wire transfer. Meredith desperately needed the capital to secure the lease and buy equipment for her new luxury wellness spa. She told me if I did not find the money, she would divorce me and take everything. I was trapped, Dad. Please do not call the cops. Once her spa opens and becomes successful, I swear I will pay you back every single cent. I love you." I read the message twice. I did not feel angry. I did not feel an urge to scream. I simply felt an overwhelming, crushing emptiness. The profound, unconditional love I had held for my son for 35 years completely evaporated in that exact moment. The illusion of the good boy I had sacrificed my entire life to raise shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He was not a victim of a manipulative wife. He was a willing accomplice. He watched his wife throw his elderly father out into a freezing rainstorm, demanding a password to an account he had already secretly looted. He stood there, trembling like a coward, prioritizing his toxic marriage over the safety and dignity of the man who gave him life. He sold my blood, sweat, and tears to fund the vanity project of an arrogant woman who despised my very existence. He was hoping I would just wander off into the streets and quietly disappear so they could enjoy the spoils of their betrayal. I slowly placed the phone face up on the mahogany table, allowing Jonathan to read the confession. Jonathan leaned over and scanned the glowing text message. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed with sharp, professional fury. "This is textbook wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse," he stated coldly. He immediately reached for his briefcase, pulling out his cell phone. "I am calling the federal authorities right now, Wade. We can have Kendrick and Meredith arrested before midnight. They will be facing years in federal prison for this stunt." I reached across the table and firmly placed my hand over his, stopping him in his tracks. Jonathan looked up at me, completely stunned by my reaction. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain batter the glass against the backdrop of the glittering city lights. A cold, calculated clarity washed over my mind. "Do not call the police yet," I ordered, my voice dangerously low and steady. "Getting them arrested today is far too easy. They need to understand exactly whose money they stole. Find out the exact address of her new luxury spa, and more importantly, find me the name of the corporate entity that owns the building." Jonathan did not ask any further questions. He simply nodded, opened his encrypted laptop, and his fingers flew across the keyboard. The silence in the presidential suite was broken only by the rapid clicking of keys and the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. It took him exactly 12 minutes to trace the web of commercial leases and shell companies. He turned his screen toward me. "The building your daughter-in-law leased is a prime piece of commercial real estate in the upscale arts district," Jonathan explained. "The property is currently owned by a mid-sized holding company called Apex Investment Group." I stared at the name on the screen, and a bitter smile touched my lips. Hearing about corporate holding companies took me straight back to the 1980s. Back then, I was a young, ambitious black electrician trying to buy my first multifamily rental property. I had the down payment saved up in cash from working grueling hours, but every single bank turned me down. They looked at my skin color, my calloused hands, and the zip code I grew up in, and they stamped my applications with a swift, brutal denial. It was the era of redlining, and the system was rigorously designed to keep men like me out of the wealth-building game. But I refused to be a victim of a rigged system. I spent my nights at the public library, reading everything I could find about corporate law, real estate trusts, and limited liability companies. I quickly learned that while the banks might discriminate against a black man in a work shirt, they never discriminated against an anonymous corporate entity holding a briefcase full of cash. I started creating LLCs with incredibly boring, untraceable names. I bought my first property through a blind trust, then my second, and then a commercial strip mall. The sellers and the bankers never knew that the invisible tycoon acquiring premium real estate across the state was the exact same guy fixing their circuit breakers and unclogging their pipes. That hard lesson became the foundation of my entire empire. I tapped my index finger against the mahogany table, bringing my focus back to the present moment. "Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I do not just want to know about Apex Investment Group. I want to own them. Find out what their liquidity situation is right now." Jonathan raised his eyebrows slightly, but he immediately made a quick phone call to his acquisitions team. A few tense minutes passed before he hung up and looked at me with a sharp grin. "Apex is highly leveraged right now, Wade," he reported. "They have been trying to offload that specific commercial sector for the last quarter to cover bad investments elsewhere. They are actively looking for a discreet, fast buyout. Buy the entire commercial plaza," I commanded, without a second of hesitation. "Pay whatever premium is required to close the deal by the end of business today. Use the liquid funds from my primary offshore trust. Offer them a completely unconditional cash buyout, but stipulate that the transition of ownership must be executed immediately and kept strictly confidential. I want absolute control over that building before the sun sets." Jonathan did not waste a single breath. He immediately began drafting the binding letters of intent and mobilizing my financial assets. Over the next 4 hours, I sat in that luxurious suite drinking black coffee and signing a mountain of expedited digital contracts. I watched millions of dollars flow silently through the banking system with a few strokes of a pen. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the final wire transfer cleared. The ink dried on the acquisition documents, making my holding company the sole undisputed owner of the entire commercial plaza. I was officially the owner of the very building where Meredith had sunk my stolen $200,000. I was now my arrogant daughter-in-law's absolute landlord. She had drained my fake retirement account to sign a 5-year lease in a building that I now possessed outright. Every single upgrade she purchased, every marble tile she installed, and every expensive fixture she bought with my stolen money was now permanently affixed to my commercial property. She had effectively handed my own money right back into my pocket, while trapping herself in a legally binding commercial contract with a ghost. The sheer irony of the situation was a cold, satisfying justice. The trap was set, and she was already standing right in the center of it. While Jonathan finalized the recording of the deeds, he pushed a sleek tablet across the table. "You might want to see this, Wade," he said, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "My team just pulled up her public social media profiles. She has been highly active all afternoon." I looked down at the bright screen. Meredith had posted a live video on her Instagram account. She was standing in the middle of her newly renovated spa, which she had pretentiously named Serenity Cove. The place was dripping in unnecessary luxury, with imported Italian marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and velvet lounging chairs. She was holding a glass of expensive champagne, wearing a tailored white silk suit that screamed of elitism. The video was flooded with tags mentioning all of her wealthy, upper-class white friends, inviting them to her exclusive grand opening event, scheduled for that very evening. She looked directly into the camera with that same smug, entitled smile she wore when she threw me out into the rain. "I am just so incredibly blessed and entirely self-made," she crooned to her thousands of followers. "Building this luxury sanctuary took so much blood, sweat, and tears, but it is finally ready. We are officially opening our doors tonight to the most exclusive clientele in the city." She took a delicate sip of her champagne, and then her smile turned sharp and venomous. "And honestly, today has just been a massive day of cleansing for me," she continued, her voice dripping with malicious implication. "I firmly believe that to build an empire, you have to aggressively clear out the toxic energy holding you back. I finally took out the heavy, useless trash from our home this morning to make room for my new peaceful life. Some dead weight just needs to be dragged to the curb." My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. She was soaking in the praise of her followers, parading around as a brilliant entrepreneur, while casually bragging about discarding her husband's elderly father like a stray dog. She was celebrating her theft in broad daylight, completely convinced that her cruel actions carried zero consequences. She truly believed I was shivering in an alleyway somewhere while she toasted to her fake success. I pushed the tablet away and stood up from the mahogany table. The grand opening for her stolen spa was starting in less than 2 hours. Jonathan looked up at me, packing away his legal documents. "Would you like me to send a representative from the property management firm to shut down the event?" he asked, professionally. I slowly shook my head. "No," I replied, buttoning my shirt. "I'm going to attend the grand opening myself." Jonathan gestured toward the adjoining dressing room. "The hotel tailor has prepared several bespoke suits for you, Wade." I glanced at the closed dressing room doors, and then looked down at the clothes I was already wearing. My damp, faded flannel jacket, my scuffed, heavy work boots, and my worn-out flat cap. "I will not be needing a suit tonight," I said, grabbing my wet jacket from the chair. She wanted to throw out the useless trash. It is only right that the trash makes a personal appearance at her high society party. The rain had finally stopped by the time the Lincoln Town car dropped me off at the corner of the Arts District. I told my driver to wait and walked the remaining block to Serenity Cove. The exterior of the building had been completely transformed. What used to be a standard commercial storefront was now an obnoxious display of modern wealth. Valet attendants in crisp white uniforms were busy parking imported sports cars and luxury SUVs. A red carpet led up to the gleaming glass doors. I bypassed the valet stand, completely ignoring the confused shouts of the attendants. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside the grand lobby. The interior was blindingly bright. Meredith had spared absolutely no expense with my stolen money. The floors were covered in pristine white marble that reflected the light from massive crystal chandeliers. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of exclusive tranquility. The room was packed with the local elite. There were women in expensive cocktail dresses and men in tailored designer suits, sipping premium champagne from delicate fluted glasses. My entrance was like tossing a heavy brick into a quiet pond. I was wearing my damp, faded flannel jacket, my heavy, scuffed work boots, and my old flat cap. My hands were rough and calloused. To them, I did not just look out of place. I looked like a threat. The classical music kept playing, but the conversations around me died instantly. A ripple of absolute silence spread across the room as dozens of wealthy, privileged eyes turned to stare at me. Their faces twisted into masks of shock, disgust, and blatant racial profiling. They gripped their champagne glasses tightly, whispering to one another behind their hands. They looked at me exactly the way bank managers had looked at me in the 1980s. To them, I was just a dirty old black man who had somehow wandered off the street and contaminated their pristine high society sanctuary. A waiter carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres froze in his tracks, staring at my muddy boots staining the perfect white marble. I kept my head held high, my posture completely straight, and walked deeper into the room. Meredith was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of local social media influencers and wealthy investors. She was laughing loudly, her head thrown back, a picture of absolute triumph. Then her eyes landed on me. The laughter died in her throat. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking pale and horrified. For a split second, I saw pure panic flash in her eyes. She quickly muttered an excuse to her wealthy friends and marched directly toward me. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor, sounding like sharp little gunshots. She reached me and immediately grabbed my arm with a vicious, digging grip. Her acrylic nails dug into the fabric of my old jacket as she forcibly dragged me away from the crowd and into a secluded, dimly lit hallway near the luxury restrooms. Once we were out of sight, she turned on me with a face twisted in absolute fury. Her voice was a harsh, venomous whisper designed to cut deep. "What the hell are you doing here, Wade?" she hissed, her eyes darting nervously back toward the lobby to make sure none of her investors were watching. "How did you even get past the front door looking like a filthy vagrant? This is a high-end luxury establishment, not a downtown soup kitchen. You are completely ruining my aesthetic." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic sense of entitlement wash over me. I looked past her shoulder and saw Kendrick standing near the champagne bar. He had seen me walk in. But just like earlier that afternoon, he immediately turned his back, taking a sudden, intense interest in his drink. He was too much of a coward to face me, and too weak to stand up to his wife. "I told you to get out of my life and stay out," Meredith continued, her voice dripping with subtle racist undertones. "You do not belong here. You never belonged in our world. You are nothing but an old, outdated relic dragging us down. If you think you can show up here and beg for a handout in front of my friends, you are out of your mind. I am calling security and having you thrown out on the street exactly where you belong." She frantically waved her hand, signaling a large, burly security guard stationed near the back exit. He immediately began walking toward us, his hand resting aggressively on his utility belt. The security guard approached with heavy, intimidating steps. He stopped right beside Meredith and placed a thick, heavy hand firmly on my shoulder, preparing to forcefully escort me off the premises. "Ma'am, do you want me to call the police and report a trespasser?" the guard asked, his eyes glaring at me with the same prejudiced suspicion as the rest of the guests. Meredith smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "Yes," she said triumphantly. "Throw this trash out immediately." Instead of resisting or raising my voice, I simply reached up and brushed the security guard's hand off my shoulder, with a slow, deliberate, and quietly authoritative movement. The guard was so surprised by my calm, commanding demeanor that he actually took a half step back. I looked Meredith directly in the eyes. I did not show any anger or hurt. Instead, I gave her a slow, cold, and entirely peaceful smile. "You have done a remarkable job decorating this place, Meredith," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "The marble floors are a very nice touch. It must have cost an absolute fortune to build all of this from nothing." My sheer calm unnerved her completely. Her smug smirk faltered. She had expected me to yell, to beg, or to cause a massive scene that she could use to play the victim. My quiet, polite compliment threw her entirely off balance. I did not give her a chance to respond. I simply adjusted my flat cap, turned my back on her, and walked calmly back toward the main lobby. The affluent guests parted like the Red Sea as I walked through them, making sure not to let their expensive designer clothes brush against my damp jacket. I walked directly to the pristine white reception desk near the front entrance. A young, terrified receptionist watched me approach, holding her breath. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The paper was heavy and extremely expensive. I placed it deliberately on the center of the marble counter. I tapped it exactly once with my calloused index finger. I gave Kendrick one final look of profound disappointment across the room. Then I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out into the cool night air, leaving her stolen empire behind me. Inside the lobby, Meredith practically sprinted to the reception desk the moment the glass doors closed behind me. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed with lingering anger and confusion. She snatched the cream-colored envelope off the marble counter. She was absolutely certain it was a pathetic begging letter, or perhaps a handwritten threat she could hand over to the police to secure a permanent restraining order against me. She ripped the top of the envelope open and pulled out the single sheet of thick paper inside. It was not a letter from me. It was an official legal document bearing the heavy embossed corporate seal of the Apex Investment Group, the sole property management entity of the building. It was a formal, legally binding notice of immediate operational suspension. The document explicitly stated that due to unauthorized structural modifications discovered during a recent corporate audit, the commercial premises were deemed critically unsafe. The newly opened luxury spa was ordered to shut down immediately for a mandatory 7-day structural assessment. No clients or staff were legally permitted on the premises starting at midnight. Any violation of this direct order would result in the immediate termination of the commercial lease and severe financial penalties. Her exclusive grand opening was legally over before it even truly began. The fallout from the operational suspension notice hit Serenity Cove like a devastating financial earthquake. For the next 3 agonizing days, my phone remained completely silent, while Meredith and Kendrick scrambled to navigate the bureaucratic nightmare I had legally trapped them in. With the heavy glass doors permanently locked and the crystal chandeliers turned off, the luxury spa was hemorrhaging thousands of dollars every single day. Expensive specialized staff demanded their salaries. High-end affluent clients angrily demanded immediate refunds for canceled luxury treatments. The private investors she had so arrogantly bragged to on social media were undoubtedly demanding aggressive answers she simply did not have. By Thursday morning, my phone finally rang. It was Kendrick. I sat in my plush leather armchair looking out over the sprawling city skyline and answered the call. His voice was frantic and breathless, lacking any trace of the arrogant silence he had displayed when his wife threw me out into the freezing rain. "Dad, you have got to help us," he pleaded, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. The building management shut down the spa over some ridiculous structural permit issue. We are losing $10,000 a day. The contractors are demanding immediate payment to fix the alleged violations, and the bank is threatening to pull our entire commercial credit line. I need you to co-sign a new commercial loan immediately. They need a guarantor with a pristine financial history to secure the funds. You have to sign the promissory note today, or we lose absolutely everything. I listened to his desperate rambling with a cold, hard detachment. He had not offered a single apology for tossing me onto the street like a stray dog. He did not ask if I had a warm roof over my head or hot food to eat. He was simply calling the man he believed was a penniless retired mechanic to somehow miraculously absorb his massive financial failure. He felt completely entitled to my unconditional rescue. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark coffee, letting the silence stretch out to force him to sit in his own suffocating anxiety. "I will not be signing any promissory notes for you, Kendrick," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of emotion. A real man does not use his father's forged signature to steal his entire retirement savings, and then call to beg that same father to act as a human financial shield when the severe consequences finally arrive. "You made your bed. Now you have to figure out exactly how to sleep in it." Before Kendrick could stammer out another pathetic, cowardly excuse, I heard a violent scuffle on the other end of the line. Meredith snatched the phone directly from his hands. Her voice came through the speaker, dripping with pure venom and unhinged desperation. "Listen to me, you useless old man," she hissed aggressively. "If you do not march down to the bank and co-sign that loan right now, we are going to liquidate the only other valuable asset we have left. We are selling the house today. The house. The very same house I had poured my blood and sweat into purchasing. The house where I had painstakingly built a beautiful memorial shrine for my late wife." Meredith laughed a sharp, cruel sound that grated against my ears. "That is right, Wade," she taunted, her voice rising with arrogant confidence. "The real estate market in this upscale neighborhood is incredibly hot right now. We already called a high-end broker. We are putting the property on the market this afternoon. We are going to extract all the cash equity out of it to save my business. And do not think for 1 second we will be keeping any of your worthless old junk. I am throwing your ratty vintage furniture and that pathetic dusty altar you keep for your dead wife straight into the local landfill where it belongs. You do not own that property. That property deed has my husband's name printed right on the top of it. You have absolutely no power here. You are nothing but a homeless beggar." She slammed the phone down, terminating the call before I could even utter a single syllable. She truly believed she had checkmated me. She thought that because Kendrick's name was listed on the primary deed, they possessed the absolute legal authority to sell the property out from under me and erase every trace of my existence. I placed my phone gently on the mahogany table and let the profound, heavy silence of the hotel suite wash over me. I closed my eyes and vividly pictured the small, beautifully crafted wooden altar in the corner of that living room. It held the ashes of my beloved Gwendolyn, alongside her favorite silver locket, and the faded photograph from our wedding day. Gwen was a fiercely intelligent and deeply protective black woman who understood the harsh, unforgiving realities of this world better than anyone. I remembered the very last conversation we had in her quiet hospital room, just days before cancer finally took her from me. She had gripped my rough, calloused hand with her frail, trembling fingers and looked at me with an intensity I would never forget. "Wade, you have to love our boy," she had whispered, her breathing shallow but her spirit unbreakable. "Love him and guide him, but promise me you will never give up the keys to your own survival. Do not hand over absolute control of your life to anyone, not even to our own blood. The world is far too cold to leave yourself defenseless." I had almost forgotten her vital warning when I decided to pay for that suburban house and put the deed in Kendrick's name to give him a sense of pride. but Gwen's profound wisdom had echoed loud enough in the back of my mind to guide my hand. I had taken one singular, crucial legal precaution before the ink ever dried on that real estate contract. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed my attorney. Jonathan answered on the first ring. "Jonathan," I said, my voice steady and incredibly resolute. "Meredith is trying to fast-track the sale of the family home to cover her massive commercial losses. She is bringing a real estate broker into the house today." Jonathan chuckled softly on the other end of the line, his tone sharp and professional. "She clearly did not bother to read the fine print on the county property records," he noted. "Exactly," I replied. "It is time to enforce the hidden clause we established. I want you to officially activate the life estate immediately. Stop that pending sale dead in its tracks." "Consider it done," Wade Jonathan said efficiently. "I will have a sheriff's deputy physically at that property before they can even print the marketing brochures." 2 days later, Meredith wasted absolutely no time executing her threat. She had aggressively pushed a high-end real estate broker to stage a rapid open house. She was standing in the center of the living room, wearing a bright, tailored dress, aggressively pitching the spacious layout to a wealthy couple looking for a quick investment property. She gestured wildly, completely ignoring the heavy boxes of my personal belongings she had callously shoved into the hallway. Just as she was loudly bragging about the high resale value of the neighborhood, heavy, purposeful knocks echoed from the front door. It was not another prospective buyer. It was a uniformed county sheriff's deputy holding a thick stack of legal documents. He stepped into the foyer and handed the paperwork directly to a highly confused Meredith. "This is a court-ordered property injunction, ma'am," the deputy announced loudly, shutting down the entire open house. "This property is legally bound by a life estate deed belonging to Mr. Wade Callahan. You are strictly prohibited from selling, mortgaging, or transferring this house without his explicit written consent." The prospective buyers immediately backed away toward the front door. The high-end real estate broker looked completely mortified, hastily packing his glossy marketing brochures and apologizing profusely as he practically sprinted out of the house. Meredith snatched the thick stack of legal documents from the hands of the deputy. Her perfectly manicured fingers shook violently as her eyes frantically scanned the highlighted text. "5 years ago, when I handed over the hard cash for that down payment, I made absolutely sure my attorney embedded a standard but ironclad life estate clause deep within the county property records. It meant that while Kendrick technically held the title to the property, I retained the absolute legal right to occupy, control, and utilize the premises for the entirety of my natural life. The house could not be sold, mortgaged, or altered in any significant way without my officially notarized signature." Meredith's face turned a violent shade of crimson, her pristine high society facade completely shattered in an instant. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, waving the papers aggressively in the deputy's face. She demanded he arrest me for fraud, claiming I had somehow tricked her husband. The deputy remained entirely unfazed by her hysterical outburst. He firmly placed a hand on his utility belt and advised her to consult a qualified lawyer before turning around and walking out the door. She was left standing in the middle of a perfectly staged living room, holding a completely worthless piece of paper. As soon as the heavy front door clicked shut, Meredith turned her unhinged fury directly onto Kendrick. He had been standing in the corner of the room, perfectly silent, like a terrified spectator. "You absolute worthless idiot," she shrieked, throwing the heavy legal documents directly at his chest. The papers scattered across the polished hardwood floor. "You told me this house belonged to you. You told me we owned this property free and clear. How could you let your pathetic, uneducated mechanic of a father outsmart you like this?" Kendrick raised his hands defensively, trying to calm her down, but she aggressively swatted them away. "Do not touch me," she yelled, her voice echoing harshly off the walls. "You are a complete failure, Kendrick. I married a man I thought could provide me with the luxury lifestyle I deserve, and instead, I am chained to a weak, spineless loser who cannot even control a decrepit old man." She paced around the room, kicking one of my packed cardboard boxes violently. Kendrick finally found a tiny shred of his voice. "Meredith, please," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I did not know about the clause. My dad handled all the paperwork with his lawyer when he bought the place. I just signed where they told me to sign. We can figure this out. We can try to refinance something else." Meredith let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Refinance what, Kendrick? You have absolutely nothing. You are nothing without me. You let your father play us for fools. You let a senile old fool living in a basement dictate my entire financial future." She pointed a sharp finger right between his eyes. "You better fix this, Kendrick. You better find a way to get me my money, or I am walking out that door and taking everything." Kendrick stood there, paralyzed, finally seeing the raw, unmasked toxicity of the woman he had sold his soul to please. He had thrown his own father out into a storm for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a broken, automated teller machine. While Meredith and Kendrick were tearing their toxic marriage apart inside the house they could not sell, I was sitting comfortably in the presidential suite at the Ritz. Jonathan Hayes walked into the room, carrying a sleek black briefcase. He did not look like a man dealing with a simple real estate dispute. He looked like a ruthless prosecutor preparing for a major criminal trial. He took a seat across from me and placed a thick, heavily bound dossier on the mahogany table. "Wade," he said, his tone entirely devoid of its usual professional warmth. "I tasked my best private investigators to dig into the financial movements regarding the spa. What we found goes far beyond a simple vanity project or poor business management. This is highly calculated financial extraction." I opened the dossier. The first few pages were detailed banking wire traces, but the following pages were filled with high-resolution surveillance photographs. The pictures showed Meredith at various high-end restaurants and luxury hotel bars. She was not alone. She was intimately accompanied by a younger white man with a heavily tattooed arm and an arrogant smirk. "That is Bradley Lawson," Jonathan explained, pointing to the photographs. "He is a local personal trainer with a documented gambling addiction and a massive mountain of private debt. Your daughter-in-law did not just forge your signature to build a luxury spa. The spa was largely a front. She funneled over $80,000 of your stolen retirement funds directly into Lawson's offshore accounts to pay off his illicit gambling debts. She used the rest of your money to fund their weekend getaways and to lease a luxury sports car entirely in his name." I stared at the photographs, feeling a cold, profound disgust wash over me. She had manipulated my son, destroyed my home, and thrown me out into the street, all to finance a secret double life with her broke lover. She had convinced Kendrick that the theft was absolutely necessary for their marital future, while actively draining those stolen funds to sustain a sordid affair. She had played my son for an absolute fool. The depth of her deceit was staggering. She was not just an entitled gold digger. She was a meticulous, ruthless predator, feeding on my family. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, waiting for my reaction. "Should I dispatch a courier to deliver these photographs directly to Kendrick?" he asked professionally. "He needs to see exactly who he betrayed his father for." I looked at the glossy photos of Meredith and her lover laughing, sipping expensive champagne, paid for with my sweat and blood. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Do not send Kendrick anything. If I show him these pictures right now, he will just play the victim and crawl into a hole. He needs to feel the full crushing weight of his own financial betrayal first. He needs to be completely backed into a corner of his own making." I closed the dossier and slid it back across the table. "Instead of dealing with the marriage, I want to deal with the business. Contact the commercial property management team for the Apex Investment Group. Issue an immediate administrative notice to Serenity Cove. Tell them that due to the severe liability concerns surrounding her unauthorized structural renovations, the risk profile of the building has drastically changed. I want her commercial rent tripled effective immediately. Let us see exactly how her new lover helps her pay for that." The following morning, a bright neon orange administrative notice was firmly taped directly to the center of the heavy glass doors of Serenity Cove. The document bore the official seal of the Apex Investment Group. It was a formal, non-negotiable addendum to her commercial lease. The notice explicitly stated that, due to the severe liability risks introduced by her highly unauthorized structural renovations, the monthly rent for the commercial property was being immediately tripled to offset the massive insurance premiums and legal liabilities. When Meredith arrived at the plaza to meet with a contractor and read the notice, she completely lost her mind. According to the highly detailed report Jonathan received from the commercial property manager, Meredith ripped the heavy paper off the glass and marched straight down the street to the local Apex management office. She kicked the heavy wooden door open and launched into a full-blown hysterical meltdown, She screamed at the terrified front desk staff, slamming her expensive designer handbag onto the reception counter with a vicious thud. She aggressively demanded to speak with the anonymous owner of the building right that very second. She shrieked that she was a prominent local entrepreneur being unfairly targeted by a faceless corporate entity and that she would not be intimidated. The senior property manager, a highly trained professional who had dealt with hostile commercial tenants for decades, simply stepped out of his office and calmly informed her that the owner's identity was strictly protected by a blind trust. He told her she had exactly 48 hours to submit the new, vastly increased rental payment or face immediate and permanent eviction. She threatened to sue, she threatened to call the local news, and she threatened to completely destroy their corporate reputation. The manager did not blink. He simply handed her a generic business card for the corporate legal department and calmly asked the building security guards to escort her off the premises. She was entirely powerless, fighting a ghost she could not even see. Cornered and rapidly running out of time, Meredith did exactly what a parasite does when its host begins to die. She turned her vicious panic entirely onto Kendrick. She relentlessly berated him inside that unsold house, demanding he fix the massive financial crater she had single-handedly created. With the conventional banks completely locking them out due to their frozen assets and massive debt-to-income ratio, she forced my son to seek out aggressive alternative funding. She demanded he go to local predatory lenders. These were loan sharks who operated out of shady strip mall offices, charging extortionate interest rates that guaranteed perpetual financial slavery, and backed their contracts with threats of physical violence. Kendrick was completely terrified. He knew that taking money from those kinds of men would put his actual physical safety at severe risk. Pushed to the absolute brink of total collapse, he desperately sought the one safety net he had always relied upon his entire life: me. He managed to track down my location, likely by calling my old union buddies who knew Jonathan represented me. Late that evening, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the heavy double doors of my presidential suite at the Ritz. I opened the door to find my 35-year-old son standing in the lavish hallway. He looked absolutely dreadful. His clothes were deeply wrinkled, his shoulders were completely slumped, and he had dark purple bags under his bloodshot eyes. He stepped cautiously into the massive suite, looking around at the crystal chandeliers and the polished mahogany furniture, with sheer, absolute bewilderment. He could not comprehend how the father he had just thrown out into the rain was residing in a luxury suite that cost more per night than he made in a whole month. I did not offer him a drink. I did not offer him a seat. I stood in the center of the room and waited for him to speak. "Dad," he choked out, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of awe and sheer desperation. "I do not know how you got this place, but I need your help. I am begging you. Meredith is forcing me to take out a $50,000 street loan to cover the new rent and the structural fines at the spa. These guys are incredibly dangerous, Dad. If I miss a single payment, they will come after me. I need you to front me the cash, just as a loan." I looked at the man standing in front of me and felt a profound, chilling emptiness where my fatherly affection used to live. I remembered working 36-hour emergency plumbing shifts, wading through freezing water in the dead of winter, just to buy him his first decent bicycle, so he would not feel inferior to the wealthy kids in our neighborhood. I had broken my back to give him a solid foundation of absolute stability, and he had squandered every single brick of it for a woman who viewed him as entirely disposable. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my posture rigid, and my gaze entirely unyielding. "You stand in my presence, and you have the sheer audacity to ask me for money," I said, my voice low, rumbling with decades of suppressed authority. "You forged my signature, Kendrick. You committed a federal crime to steal $200,000 of my hard-earned money. You stood in the hallway like a frightened child and watched your arrogant wife throw me out into a freezing storm. And now you come crawling into my hotel suite, asking me to save you from the very monsters you decided to climb into bed with." Kendrick shrank back, tears pooling in his bloodshot eyes. "Dad, please. I was stupid. I was trying to save my marriage." I cut him off immediately, my voice slicing through the air like a razor. "A real man does not use the money he stole from his own father to feed the bottomless greed of a traitor," I stated coldly. "A real man protects his family. He protects his blood. You sold your blood to buy a fake luxury lifestyle for a woman who does not even respect you enough to fight her own battles. You want $50,000. Go put on a pair of steel-toed boots, grab a heavy wrench, and work for it. You will not get a single red cent from me. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You are entirely on your own." Kendrick began to openly sob. He pleaded with me, telling me that Meredith was going to leave him, that he was going to lose the house, that his life was entirely over. I did not flinch. I felt absolutely no pity. His tears were not born of genuine remorse for betraying his father. They were born of terror, because he finally realized the bank of Wade Callahan was permanently closed. He slowly turned around his shoulders, shaking violently, preparing to make the long, humiliating walk back to the elevator. He had completely hit rock bottom. But I was not finished. I needed to shatter the final illusion he was desperately clinging to. I needed him to see exactly what he had sacrificed his father to protect. "Kendrick," I called out sharply, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Before you go back to your loving, loyal wife, I suggest you take a very close look at exactly what your stolen money has been funding." I reached over to the polished mahogany table and picked up a thick, glossy financial document. It was the highly detailed credit card statement Jonathan had procured, highlighting Meredith's hidden expenditures. I tossed the thick packet across the room. It landed heavily on the plush carpet right at his feet. "Pick it up," I commanded. Kendrick reached down with trembling hands and opened the file. His eyes rapidly scanned the highlighted lines. He saw the massive charges for luxury five-star hotel suites, romantic dinners at exclusive steakhouses, and expensive weekend getaways. But what made the remaining color completely drain from his face was the secondary guest name printed clearly alongside his wife's signature on every single receipt: Bradley Lawson. He did not just steal from his father to build a spa. He stole his father's life savings to aggressively fund his arrogant wife's secret romantic affair. Kendrick stumbled out of the elevator and into the rainy night, clutching the thick, glossy financial document like it was a physical weight crushing his chest. The drive back to the suburban house felt like a blur of neon lights and windshield wipers. He finally parked his car in the driveway of the property he legally owned but could not sell. When he pushed open the heavy front door, the house was completely silent, except for the sound of Meredith furiously typing on her laptop in the living room. She did not even look up as he walked in. "Did you get the $50,000 from your father?" she demanded, her tone sharp and expectant. "Did you finally act like a man and fix this massive mess?" Kendrick did not answer. He marched directly into the center of the living room, his hands shaking with a volatile mixture of profound grief and sudden, uncharacteristic rage. He slammed the credit card statements down onto her laptop keyboard. The glossy pages spread out, revealing every single luxury hotel charge and every expensive dinner receipt, printed clearly with her signature right next to Bradley Lawson. "I know everything, Meredith," he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "My father showed me exactly where the money went. You did not just steal from my dad to build your spa. You drained his life savings to pay off your lover. You used my father's blood money to fund your secret affair with a personal trainer." Meredith stared at the papers. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped from her face. Her eyes widened as she recognized the undeniable proof of her infidelity laid bare on the polished coffee table. But the shock only lasted a moment. The panic quickly vanished, entirely replaced by a terrifying, calculated coldness. She slowly closed her laptop, pushed the damning evidence aside, and stood up. She did not cower. She did not cry. She looked at Kendrick not with guilt, but with absolute, supreme disgust. "You actually believe this absolute garbage?" Meredith sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the financial documents. "You actually let that bitter old man plant these ridiculous lies in your head." Kendrick stepped back entirely, thrown off balance by her aggressive counterattack. "It is right there in black and white," he stammered, pointing at the receipts. "Your signature is right next to his name. It proves you have been spending the stolen money on weekend getaways with Bradley." Meredith let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut right through his fragile confidence. "Are you seriously this stupid, Kendrick?" she yelled, stepping closer until she was right in his face. "Bradley is a high-end brand consultant. I hired him to help design the marketing strategy for the spa. Those hotel charges were for industry networking events and luxury brand research. I was working myself to the bone to build an empire for us, while you were busy failing to provide for your own wife." She grabbed the papers and aggressively shoved them back into his chest. Your pathetic father manufactured these fake bank statements. He is completely obsessed with destroying our marriage. He hates that you chose me over him. He hates that I am an ambitious white woman who refuses to be controlled by a decrepit retired mechanic who belongs in a basement. He is manipulating you, Kendrick. He is using fake documents to tear us apart because he knows you are weak enough to believe him. She paused, letting her toxic words sink deep into his shattered psyche. Then her voice dropped to a deceptive, dramatic whisper. I begged you to stand up to him, she fake cried, forcing a single tear to roll down her cheek. I put everything on the line to build a beautiful life for us, and this is how you repay me, by believing the malicious lies of an old man who despises my very existence. If you were half the man you pretend to be, you would have protected me from his sick delusions. But instead, you come in here accusing me of cheating because your father fabricated a few pieces of paper. I am disgusted by you. Kendrick felt the room spinning. His entire reality was being violently warped. The hard evidence in his hands suddenly felt completely meaningless against the sheer force of her manipulation. The last remaining shred of Kendrick's backbone completely dissolved. He looked at the tears glistening on Meredith's cheeks, and the overwhelming fear of losing her swallowed him whole. He was a man who had sacrificed his own father to secure his marriage, and if he accepted the truth of her infidelity, it meant his horrific betrayal was entirely for nothing. He could not face that devastating reality. I am sorry, Meredith, he mumbled, his voice cracking as he dropped the papers onto the floor. I should not have doubted you. I was just so stressed about the money and the lease. Please do not leave me. I will fix this, I promise. Meredith's crying stopped instantly. Her posture straightened, and the cold, calculating shark returned to her eyes. She reached out and patted his cheek like a master praising an obedient dog. Good, she stated flatly, because if you want to save this marriage, we have to take extremely drastic measures. Your father has clearly lost his mind. He is forging financial documents. He is locking us out of our own property. And he is actively trying to destroy my business out of pure senile paranoia. We cannot let a mentally unstable man control our financial destiny anymore. Kendrick looked at her in confusion. What exactly are you saying, he asked. I am saying we take him to court, Meredith replied, her voice dropping to a sinister whisper. We file a formal legal petition for adult guardianship. We present these fake documents he made as proof of his severe paranoid delusions. We testify that his recent erratic behavior, shutting down the spa and hoarding the property deed, proves he is suffering from severe cognitive decline. Once the judge declares him legally incompetent and strips him of his civil rights, you will be appointed as his primary legal guardian. Kendrick's eyes widened in realization. If I am his guardian, I control all of his assets. Exactly, Meredith smirked, her eyes gleaming with dark ambition. You invalidate that ridiculous life estate clause. We sell this house, we seize whatever money he has hidden away, and we finally put him in a cheap, state-run nursing home where he belongs. It is the only way to protect ourselves from his absolute madness. 3 days later, I was sitting in the dining area of the presidential suite, enjoying a quiet breakfast, when a sharp knock echoed from the heavy double doors. My private security let the visitor in. It was a court process server. He handed me a thick manila envelope, tipped his hat, and walked away without a single word. I opened the envelope and pulled out the heavily stamped legal documents. It was an official court summons. Meredith had actually followed through with her most desperate and despicable plan yet. The documents contained a formal petition to strip me of my civil rights, requesting a mandatory psychiatric evaluation to determine my mental competency. I read through their fabricated claims of my supposed paranoia and cognitive decline. They were trying to legally erase my entire existence to steal my fortune. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I simply smiled, pulled out my phone, and dialed my attorney. Jonathan, I said, my voice entirely devoid of panic. They filed the guardianship petition. Prepare the biggest show for her. The heavy oak doors of the family court closed with a resounding thud, sealing us inside a room designed to strip away a man's freedom. The air was thick with the sterile smell of floor wax and impending judgment. I sat at the defense table with Jonathan Hayes by my side. Across the aisle sat my son and his wife. Meredith had completely shed her aggressive high society persona for the occasion. She wore a modest, pale blue dress with her hair tied back in a simple low ponytail. She held a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands, lightly dabbing at her eyes, as if she had not slept in weeks, out of pure worry. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, acting like a deeply devoted woman crushed by family tragedy. When the judge formally called the hearing to order, Meredith leaned her head against Kendrick's shoulder, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter-in-law, desperately trying to save a declining elder. Kendrick simply stared down at the polished wooden table, trapped in the prison of his own cowardice. He looked utterly defeated, but he said absolutely nothing to stop her toxic lie. Meredith's attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Sullivan, stepped up to the podium. He painted a masterful, tragic picture for the judge. He described a once proud, retired tradesman who had tragically lost his grip on reality. He spoke softly, using highly manipulative words like cognitive decline, severe paranoia, and tragic mental deterioration. He claimed that Kendrick and Meredith had tried everything to care for me in their own home, only to be met with aggressive delusions and hostility. He told the judge that my sudden departure from the house was a terrifying symptom of my advancing dementia, and that they were simply seeking legal guardianship to protect a vulnerable old man from destroying his own life. Meredith let out a perfectly timed sob, burying her face in her hands. The entire room seemed to radiate sympathy for her. She had the judge nodding along with her carefully fabricated tragedy. Attorney Sullivan then moved to the center of the courtroom, pulling a stack of freshly printed financial documents from his sleek leather briefcase. He held them up high, like a definitive smoking gun. "Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room, "we are not just making assumptions based on emotional outbursts. We have hard, undeniable proof of Mr. Callahan's severe detachment from reality." He approached the bench and handed a thick folder directly to the judge. "Over the past several weeks, my client's father has engaged in wildly erratic and dangerously irrational financial behavior. He has completely drained his modest resources, believing himself to be living a life of extreme luxury. We have acquired recent financial statements showing that Mr. Callahan has been booking the presidential suite at the downtown Ritz Hotel, racking up tens of thousands of dollars in charges." He paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the hotel bills shock the courtroom. But the tragedy does not stop at mere financial irresponsibility. Sullivan continued, lowering his voice to a dramatic whisper. Driven by severe paranoid delusions, Mr. Callahan has also been writing massive checks to private security firms and elite private investigators. He genuinely believes his own loving son and daughter-in-law are actively plotting against him. He believes there is a massive corporate conspiracy surrounding a local commercial property. These are the classic, textbook symptoms of advanced senile paranoia. He is burning through whatever meager savings he has left to fund a completely fabricated reality. Sullivan turned and pointed a sympathetic yet deeply patronizing finger directly at me. "He is a danger to himself, Your Honor. Left unchecked, this man will end up destitute and wandering the streets entirely consumed by his own tragic hallucinations. He needs immediate medical intervention and financial supervision. He needs his son to step in and take control of his estate before there is absolutely nothing left to save." Meredith sniffled loudly from the plaintiff's table, nodding in vigorous agreement with her lawyer. She looked at the judge with wide, pleading eyes, begging the court to grant her the ultimate power over my existence. They had taken my legitimate actions, my strategic moves to secure my own property and investigate her massive fraud, and brilliantly twisted them into a narrative of profound mental decay. It was a vicious, calculated legal strike, designed to lock me away in a state-run facility and hand them the absolute keys to my kingdom. Throughout this entire elaborate performance, I did not say a single word. I did not shift in my chair. I did not shake my head in denial or shout out furious objections. I simply sat there with the unyielding stillness of a mountain. I was not wearing my faded flannel jacket or my scuffed work boots today. I was wearing a charcoal bespoke suit crafted by the finest tailor in the city, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. My posture was perfectly rigid, my shoulders squared, and my hands rested calmly on the defense table. I projected an aura of absolute supreme authority that completely contradicted the pathetic narrative her lawyer was spinning. While Sullivan rambled on about my supposed dementia, I locked my eyes directly onto Meredith. My gaze was sharp, piercing, and entirely unwavering. I did not look at her with anger. I looked at her with the cold, calculating precision of an apex predator observing a trapped rat. Across the room, Meredith slowly began to feel the heavy, crushing weight of my stare. She tried to maintain her weeping facade, but her eyes kept nervously darting back to my face. Every time she looked, she found me staring right through her carefully constructed mask. I was staring straight into the hollow, greedy void of her soul. She expected an old man throwing a confused tantrum, but instead, she was facing a quiet, immovable force she could not comprehend. My sheer, absolute silence began to unnerve her deeply. I could see the tiny, almost imperceptible signs of panic fracturing her composure. Her breathing grew slightly erratic. She shifted uncomfortably in her wooden chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs. She nervously rubbed her thumbs together, ruining her pristine manicure. The longer I stared, the more the temperature in her blood seemed to drop. A sudden, terrifying chill ran down her spine. She realized in that suffocating moment that I was not panicking because I already knew exactly how this entire charade was going to end. She could feel the impending doom creeping into the courtroom, but she was too arrogant to understand the massive trap she had just walked blindly into. She thought she was the hunter closing in for the final kill, but she was merely prey, walking willingly into the jaws of a behemoth. The judge finally lowered the thick stack of financial documents and looked over the bench at my defense table, Attorney Hayes. The judge addressed my lawyer with a stern expression. The petitioner has presented a rather concerning pattern of highly erratic behavior. Do you have a medical expert present today to testify to your client's cognitive competency and explain these massive, uncharacteristic expenditures? Jonathan Hayes stood up slowly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a supremely confident smile. No, Your Honor, Jonathan replied, his voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. We did not bring a psychiatrist to this hearing today because my client does not suffer from any medical condition whatsoever. His expenditures are not the result of paranoid delusions. They are the standard operating expenses of a highly active and incredibly wealthy corporate portfolio. To clarify this matter to the court, I would like to call my first two witnesses. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open simultaneously. Jonathan gestured toward the center aisle. I call the Regional Director of the Federal Reserve Bank and Special Agent Thomas Reynolds of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Regional Director of the Federal Reserve Bank, a distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccable gray suit, walked past the stunned plaintiffs and took his place at the witness stand. He was sworn in, and Jonathan immediately presented him with a sealed financial portfolio. Jonathan spoke clearly for the entire courtroom to hear, asking the director to clarify my actual financial standing, since the opposing counsel had just categorized me as a destitute old man burning through his final pennies due to severe cognitive decline. The director adjusted his microphone and looked directly at the judge. He stated with absolute authority that the claims made by the petitioner were not just inaccurate, but completely absurd. He informed the court that I am one of the most brilliant and sophisticated private investors in the entire state. He detailed how over the past 40 years, I had built a massive commercial real estate empire through a highly complex network of limited liability companies and blind trusts. He testified that I currently exercise absolute executive control over an investment portfolio conservatively valued at over $45 million. The expenses cited by Meredith and her lawyer, including the luxury hotel suite and the private security retainers, represented less than a fraction of a percent of my monthly liquid dividend yields. The director made it abundantly clear that I was not suffering from financial paranoia. I was simply conducting standard high-level corporate operations to protect my massive commercial assets from hostile actors. The entire courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur of shock. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding immediate order, but the damage to their pathetic narrative was already done. Their case was entirely destroyed in a matter of minutes. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Meredith. The transformation of her face was a masterpiece of absolute terror. The fake, delicate tears she had been squeezing out moments ago instantly dried up, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Her jaw literally dropped open, and all the blood violently drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a pale, lifeless ghost. She gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. I could practically see the gears in her head violently grinding and snapping as she frantically connected the dots. The realization hit her with the crushing force of a freight train. The Apex Investment Group. The sudden tripling of her commercial lease. The structural suspension notice that shut down her grand opening. It was all my doing. The man she had maliciously banished to a damp basement. The man she had mocked as a filthy, uneducated relic. The man she had casually thrown out into a freezing rainstorm was the multi-million-dollar tycoon who literally owned the ground she stood on. Her deeply ingrained, toxic superiority complex completely imploded in an instant. She had thought she was outsmarting a vulnerable old fool, but she had actually declared war on a financial leviathan. Beside her, Kendrick looked like he was about to physically vomit. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the father he had betrayed, the man he thought he needed to steal from to survive, could have handed him the world if he had only shown a shred of loyalty. He had traded an inheritance of tens of millions of dollars for a deeply manipulative woman who was currently dragging him into absolute ruin. Meredith's slick attorney Sullivan began to aggressively shuffle his papers, his confident demeanor entirely shattered. He looked at his client with a mixture of confusion and intense anger, realizing she had fed him a massive lie and sent him completely unarmed into a legal slaughterhouse. He tried to stand up, to object, to stutter out some pathetic excuse, but his voice failed him. Jonathan was not even close to being finished. He thanked the bank director and immediately called Special Agent Thomas Reynolds to the stand. The FBI agent walked forward with the heavy, intimidating presence of federal law enforcement, carrying a thick evidence box. He took the oath and sat down facing the judge. Jonathan projected his voice across the tense room, stating that while the petitioner claimed to protect me, the federal agency had recently opened an aggressive criminal investigation into the missing $200,000 from my personal retirement account. Agent Reynolds nodded and opened his evidence box. He explained in a clinical, booming voice that they originally received a confession from Kendrick, taking full responsibility for the forged wire transfer. However, federal financial crime units do not simply take confessions at face value. They subpoenaed the high-definition security footage from the bank branch on the date the fraudulent transfer was initiated. They also ran a full forensic handwriting analysis on the submitted power of attorney and the wire authorization forms. The agent pulled out a large, glossy photograph and handed it to the bailiff to present to the judge. He announced that the person who walked into that bank, who presented the forged legal documents, and who successfully transferred $200,000 out of my account was not my son Kendrick. The security footage clearly identified the perpetrator as Meredith. The entire courtroom gasped collectively. Kendrick's head snapped up, looking at his wife in pure shock. He had confessed to the crime because Meredith had manipulated him into believing they would both go down if he did not take the fall as the biological son. But the truth was far more sinister. She had executed the entire federal crime herself, expertly, forging my signature and initiating the wire fraud while keeping Kendrick completely in the dark until it was already done. Agent Reynolds continued relentlessly. He revealed that they had successfully traced the laundered funds. While a portion was indeed used to secure a commercial lease, a significant percentage of the stolen money was actively funneled into offshore accounts belonging to a man named Bradley Lawson. Meredith did not just steal from her father-in-law. She committed identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny to finance an illicit romantic affair. The judge's face turned completely crimson with absolute outrage. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. He roared with a voice dripping with venom that his court would absolutely not be used as an instrument for a hostile criminal conspiracy. He declared that the petition for guardianship was immediately dismissed with extreme prejudice. He then turned his furious gaze directly toward Meredith, who was visibly shaking, hyperventilating, and completely unable to form a single word. The judge announced that he was ordering the bailiffs to detain her within the courtroom, and that he was transferring the entire file directly to the Federal Criminal Division for immediate prosecution. The heavy metal cuffs rattled as the bailiffs quickly moved in behind her. Meredith sat entirely paralyzed, her skin ashen, staring at me in absolute pale terror. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked her dead in the eyes and coldly adjusted my crisp silk tie, sealing her devastating fate in perfect silence. Meredith did not stay in a jail cell that first night. Her parents desperately leveraged their own modest home to post her exorbitant federal bail, keeping her out of a jumpsuit pending her grand jury indictment. But while she managed to secure a temporary physical release, her entire fabricated world was rapidly burning to the ground. The news of the courtroom drama spread like absolute wildfire across the city. The wealthy investors she had aggressively courted pulled their funding before the sun even set, completely severing all ties to avoid being implicated in a high-profile federal wire fraud investigation. Serenity Cove, the luxury spa she built with my stolen retirement funds, collapsed in a matter of hours. The next morning, a massive crowd of angry, affluent clients swarmed the locked glass doors of the plaza, demanding immediate refunds for their expensive prepaid luxury packages. Her highly paid specialized staff quickly realized they were never going to see their paychecks and ruthlessly abandoned her, taking whatever expensive spa products they could carry as compensation. Her meticulously curated social media presence became a digital graveyard. The same high society influencers who had happily drank her free champagne at the opening event were now publicly denouncing her as a total fraud. Brands dropped her sponsorships instantly. Her phone rang incessantly, not with offers of support, but with aggressive collection calls and furious threats from angry creditors. She was completely and utterly bankrupt, stripped of every single dollar, every high-class connection, and every ounce of her heavily manufactured prestige. She was drowning in an ocean of severe consequences, with absolutely no life raft in sight. Kendrick had completely cut her off. He packed his bags and left the suburban house, refusing to answer any of her desperate text messages. She was entirely alone, barricaded inside a cold, unsold house, facing a mountain of federal charges and staggering commercial debt. The final devastating blow arrived precisely at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. A process server pounded on the front door of her house and handed her a bright red legal document. It was an emergency commercial eviction notice from the Apex Investment Group. Because she had entirely failed to pay the newly tripled rent and ignored the critical structural safety violations, the property management team was officially seizing the commercial premises. The notice explicitly stated she had exactly 24 hours to remove any remaining personal property before the locks were permanently changed and her corporate assets liquidated to cover the massive outstanding balance. The sheer reality of losing the very last piece of her fraudulent empire finally pushed Meredith over the edge of absolute madness. Driven by a volatile mixture of blinding panic and unhinged desperation, she grabbed her car keys and recklessly drove straight downtown to the corporate headquarters of the Apex Investment Group. She parked her leased luxury car illegally on the curb and stormed through the revolving glass doors of the towering skyscraper. She was a complete mess, wearing wrinkled clothes, her hair unkempt, and her eyes wild with hysteria. She aggressively bypassed the lobby security desk, completely ignoring the armed guard shouting for her to stop. She squeezed into the private executive elevator just as the metal doors were closing rapidly, pressing the button for the top floor. She was determined to use every ounce of her manipulative charm to beg, bargain, or threaten the anonymous landlord into giving her a desperate extension. She truly believed that if she could just get in front of the man in charge, she could twist the narrative, play the tragic victim, and somehow magically pause the eviction process. She stepped out onto the executive floor, breathing heavily, and marched directly toward the primary reception desk, prepared to unleash a hurricane of demands. The plush carpets and silent corridors of the corporate floor sharply contrasted with the chaotic storm raging inside her head. She ignored the expensive artwork and the quiet elegance of the holding company. She was a woman, fighting for her last breath of social relevance, and she was ready to tear down the entire building if it meant saving her stolen spa. Meredith slammed her hands down on the polished marble counter of the executive reception desk, startling the highly professional secretary. "I need to speak to the chief executive officer, right this very second," Meredith screamed, her voice echoing harshly through the quiet, elegant space. "I am the owner of Serenity Cove, and your company is aggressively trying to destroy my livelihood. This eviction notice is completely illegal. I am the victim of a massive family misunderstanding and a vicious smear campaign. If I just get 30 days to restructure my finances, I can pay the entire rent." The secretary, a remarkably calm woman in a sharp tailored suit, did not flinch at the sudden aggressive outburst. She calmly picked up her desk phone and prepared to call building security to have the hysterical woman forcibly removed from the premises. But Meredith refused to back down. She leaned completely over the marble counter, her eyes wide and frantic. "You do not understand," she yelled, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "My entire life is on the line right now. I am facing federal charges. My husband abandoned me. I have absolutely nothing left in this world. If your boss takes my business, I am completely ruined. I just need 10 minutes face-to-face with whoever runs this company. I will get on my hands and knees and beg if I have to. I am not leaving this floor until the CEO looks me in the eye and tells me he is shutting me down personally." The secretary stared at Meredith with a mixture of profound professional detachment and mild pity. Just as the secretary's finger hovered over the security button, a soft electronic buzz sounded from the secure intercom on her desk. A deep, steady voice spoke a single clear command through the small speaker. "Send her in." The secretary slowly lowered the telephone. She stood up, stepped around her desk, and gestured toward a set of massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the very end of the hall. "The CEO will see you now," she stated flatly. Meredith let out a ragged gasp of relief, wiping the smeared mascara from under her eyes, and quickly attempting to smooth down her wrinkled clothing. She took a deep breath, rehearsing her pathetic victim narrative in her head one last time, and marched confidently toward the executive suite, ready to play her ultimate trump card. Meredith pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the sprawling executive office. The room was an absolute masterpiece of corporate power, featuring rich, dark wood walls, massive bookshelves, and panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. In the center of the room sat a massive executive desk. The high-backed leather CEO chair was turned completely around, facing the glass windows, allowing the occupant to silently observe the sprawling urban landscape below. Meredith took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured tears, "I am so incredibly grateful you agreed to see me. I promise you, I am a reliable tenant. I just need a little mercy." The high-backed leather chair slowly began to rotate. The smooth, silent spin revealed the man sitting behind the desk. I was wearing my bespoke charcoal suit, my hands steeped together resting calmly on the polished wood. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. Meredith let out a horrifying, blood-curdling gasp. Her knees instantly buckled beneath her, and she collapsed completely onto the floor. Meredith hit the plush carpet of my executive office with a heavy, agonizing thud. Her entire body trembled violently as she stared up at me from the floor. The arrogant high society businesswoman, who had proudly thrown my suitcase into the freezing rain, was completely gone. In her place was a broken, pathetic shell of a woman, gasping for air. She tried to stand up, but her legs refused to support her weight. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, leaving smudges of her expensive makeup on the pristine rug. "Wade," she whimpered, her voice barely a raspy squeak. "Wade, please tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me you do not actually own this building." I remained perfectly still, looking down at her from my leather chair. I did not offer her a hand to help her up. I did not speak. I simply let the crushing reality of the situation suffocate her. When she realized I was not going to break the silence, she desperately changed her tactic. She resorted to the very thing she had actively tried to destroy: family. "Wade, we are family," she cried, reaching out to grasp the edge of my mahogany desk. "I am your daughter-in-law. I am Kendrick's wife. You cannot do this to your own family. If you evict me, if you take my business, you will destroy Kendrick. He loves me, Wade. He needs me. You know how fragile he is. If I go down, I am taking him with me. You have to save me for his sake. Please, Wade. I will do anything you ask. I will pay you back every single cent. I will work for you. Just please do not take my spa. Do not let me go to federal prison." Her pleas were a chaotic, disgusting mess of manipulation and sheer cowardice. She was actively using the son she had mercilessly manipulated as a human shield, hoping my love for my child would somehow override my demand for justice. I slowly stood up from my executive chair and walked around the massive desk. I stood directly over her trembling form. "Family," I repeated the word, tasting like venom on my tongue. You do not get to invoke the sacred name of family in my presence, Meredith. Family does not forge signatures to steal a lifetime of hard-earned retirement savings. Family does not funnel stolen cash into offshore accounts to finance a secret, illicit affair with a personal trainer. Family does not stand in a warm, dry doorway and demand passwords from an elderly man while throwing him out into a freezing storm. You do not know the first thing about family. I crouched down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers so she could clearly see the absolute zero tolerance in my eyes. You threw me out of the house I bought because you looked at my faded flannel jacket and my calloused hands, and you decided I had absolutely zero value, I stated, my voice resonating with cold, hard authority. You looked at a retired black mechanic, and you saw nothing but an obsolete burden taking up space in your fabricated luxury world. You thought you could simply discard me like useless trash because you believed my net worth was tied to a meager $200,000 decoy account. You evaluated my entire existence based on your shallow, toxic metrics. I stood back up, straightening my bespoke suit jacket. Well, Meredith, today is the day of your final appraisal. You wanted to play the high-stakes game of corporate real estate and wealth management. You wanted to sit at the big table. Now, you are sitting on my floor, and I am actively appraising the total value of your life. And looking at the mountain of commercial debt, the federal wire fraud, and the absolute moral bankruptcy you bring to my property, I find your value to be entirely in the negative. You are a highly toxic liability, Meredith, and in my business we aggressively liquidate our liabilities. Meredith let out a guttural wail, covering her face with her shaking hands. "Wade, I am begging you," she sobbed, her tears dripping onto the expensive carpet. "I have absolutely nothing left. My reputation is completely destroyed. My wealthy friends will not even answer my calls. The investors are threatening to sue me into oblivion. If you seize the spa, I will be left with millions in commercial debt that I can never repay. Please, just give me 30 days. Let me try to sell the specialized equipment. Let me try to salvage something from the wreckage." I walked back around my desk and sat down in my chair. I picked up a thick, sleek gold fountain pen. I slid the bright red commercial eviction and asset seizure notice to the center of the mahogany wood. "I did not give you 30 days when you kicked me out of my own home," I replied coldly. "I gave you exactly what you earned. Nothing." I uncapped the fountain pen and pressed the nib against the thick paper. By signing this document, I am officially authorizing the Apex Investment Group to permanently change the locks on Serenity Cove. Furthermore, I am executing a commercial lien against every single piece of luxury equipment, every imported marble tile, and every crystal chandelier you purchased with my stolen money. Your spa belongs to me now. It will be stripped down, sold for parts, and the proceeds will be deposited directly back into the trusts you tried to defraud. With 3 swift, sharp strokes, I signed my name at the bottom of the page, sealing her absolute financial ruin. The heavy sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the final nail in the coffin of her fraudulent empire. I pressed the button on my intercom system. "Security," I commanded. "The trespassing individual in my office is ready to be escorted off the premises immediately. Ensure she is removed from the building and strictly banned from ever returning." 2 massive security guards entered the executive suite seconds later. They grabbed Meredith by her arms and forcefully hauled her off the floor. She screamed and thrashed, kicking her expensive heels wildly in the air, but she was entirely powerless against them. "Drag her out through the main lobby," I ordered, turning my chair back toward the panoramic city windows. "Let everyone see exactly how a self-made entrepreneur leaves my building." As the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her hysterical screams, my desk phone rang. It was Jonathan Hayes. "Wade, the asset seizure is in full effect," he reported swiftly. "Our property management team just arrived at the commercial plaza with the locksmiths. But they are not alone. A highly coordinated task force of federal agents and local police officers just raided Serenity Cove. They are currently seizing all electronic devices and financial records from the premises. The grand jury did not waste any time. The judge just signed a federal arrest warrant for Meredith on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. She is officially a wanted fugitive. Less than an hour after the federal arrest warrant for Meredith hit the local newswire, the heavy mahogany doors of my executive suite flew open once again. My private security guards immediately stepped inside, ready to physically tackle the frantic intruder. But I raised my hand in a sharp motion to stop them. It was Kendrick. My son looked like a man who had not slept or eaten in several days. His clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, and his hands were physically shaking. He bypassed the sheer luxury of the room, completely blind to the millions of dollars of original artwork and custom leather furniture surrounding him. He rushed directly to the edge of my desk and braced his trembling hands against the polished wood. "Dad, you have to stop this," he choked out, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his absolute panic. "The feds are raiding the spa right now. They issued a national warrant for her arrest. They are going to put her in federal prison for years. You have the money, Dad. You have tens of millions. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the entire country. You can post her bail. You can make this entire nightmare go away. Please do this for me." I stared at the man standing before me. He was 35 years old, but right then, he looked exactly like a terrified, lost child, desperately clinging to a highly toxic fantasy. Even after she had financially ruined him, even after she had stripped him of his dignity and publicly humiliated our entire family, his very first instinct was still to throw himself on the tracks to save her. He was standing there, actively begging the father he had betrayed to write a massive blank check to rescue the exact woman who had orchestrated the total destruction of our lives. He wanted me to deploy my wealth to shield a predator. A profound, heavy ache settled deep inside my chest. It was the unique, agonizing pain that only a father can truly feel when he realizes he absolutely cannot protect his child from the brutal reality of the world. I could not shield Kendrick from this pain, because he desperately needed to feel it. He needed the searing heat of absolute truth to burn away the thick, suffocating layers of manipulation Meredith had wrapped tightly around his mind. I did not raise my voice to yell at him. I did not scold his pathetic behavior. I simply picked up a sleek silver remote control from my desk and pressed a single button. The heavy motorized blackout blinds slowly descended over the panoramic city windows, plunging the massive executive office into sudden darkness. A large motorized projector screen silently dropped from the ceiling on the far wall. I pressed another button, and a high-definition surveillance video illuminated the dark room. Kendrick turned his head, staring confused at the glowing screen. The video quality was crystal clear, recorded by one of the elite private investigators Jonathan had placed on Meredith's tail just hours ago. The footage showed the interior of a cheap, highly discreet motel room on the absolute outskirts of the city. Meredith was in the center of the frame, frantically throwing designer clothes and luxury items into a large suitcase. Standing right next to her, aggressively stuffing thick stacks of $100 bills into a black canvas duffel bag, was Bradley Lawson, her personal trainer, her secret lover. Kendrick stopped breathing entirely. His eyes widened to the point of tearing as he watched his wife, the woman he was currently begging me to save, moving with frantic, synchronized urgency alongside another man. The audio kicked in, picking up their hushed, panicked voices through a highly sensitive directional microphone placed by my team. "Hurry up, Bradley," Meredith snapped on the video, zipping her suitcase shut with a violent tug. "The feds are going to freeze every single bank account once they realize the spa is locked down. We need to get to the international terminal before my passport gets flagged by airport security." Kendrick watched the large, glowing screen in absolute paralyzed silence. Every single word she spoke was a physical blow, relentlessly tearing down the fragile foundation of his entire existence. But the hardest, most devastating strike was yet to come. On the screen, Bradley paused, holding a massive stack of cash, and looked at Meredith with a deeply nervous expression. "What about your husband?" he asked. "What happens when the feds show up at the house looking for the stolen $200,000? Meredith let out a cruel, dismissive scoff that echoed loudly through the high-fidelity speakers of my executive office. "Let them take him," she replied coldly, her face twisting into a mask of pure selfish malice. "Kendrick is a weak, pathetic idiot. He already confessed to the wire fraud once to try and save the business because he is desperate for my approval. When the FBI kicks down the front door, he will panic and take the absolute fall for all the commercial debt, too. He is so hopelessly obsessed with me, he will probably think keeping his mouth shut proves his ultimate loyalty. By the time the feds figure out I forged his signature and transferred the funds to your offshore accounts, we will be sitting on a beach in a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. He is the perfect sacrificial lamb. Let him rot. The video continued playing, but Kendrick was no longer watching. The sheer, absolute cruelty of her master plan hung heavily in the chilled air of the office. She was not just cheating on him. She was not just stealing from his father. She had actively and meticulously engineered a scenario where Kendrick would take the entire catastrophic fall for her federal crimes. She was going to leave him rotting in a maximum security prison cell, crushed by millions in fraudulent debt, while she escaped to a tropical paradise with her lover, using the very money he had helped her steal. I paused the video, freezing the image of Meredith's cold, calculating face on the massive screen. I pressed a button to raise the blinds, letting the bright, natural sunlight flood back into the room. I looked at my son. The ultimate truth was a brutal, bitter medicine, but it was the only cure for the toxic poison he had been swallowing for years. Kendrick's legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto his knees, hitting the plush carpet of my office with a heavy, hollow thud. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving violently as deep, gut-wrenching sobs tore through his chest. The last remaining shards of his fractured reality completely shattered, leaving him broken entirely, disillusioned, and finally awake to the horrific truth of his marriage. He had thrown away a father who would have gladly given him the world, for a woman who was actively wrapping a federal noose around his neck. I stood up, walked around my large mahogany desk, and placed a firm, heavy hand on his shaking shoulder, allowing him to mourn the complete death of his illusion. Meanwhile, entirely unaware that her grand escape plan had been fully exposed and her sacrificial lamb was sitting safely in my office, Meredith was aggressively dragging her designer suitcase across the polished floors of the International Departure Terminal, desperately rushing toward her boarding gate with a completely false sense of triumph. According to the detailed reports I received later that evening from Jonathan's elite private investigators, the scene at the airport unfolded with poetic justice. Meredith dragged her heavy designer suitcase across the highly polished terrazzo floors of the International Departure Terminal. The massive glass windows of the airport allowed the afternoon sun to cast long shadows across the bustling concourse. She wore oversized dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, attempting to blend in with the affluent travelers heading to exotic destinations. Walking briskly beside her was Bradley Lawson, carrying the black canvas duffel bag packed tightly with the remaining stolen cash. They maneuvered through the dense crowds of tourists and business people with a frantic, desperate energy disguised as purposeful urgency. Meredith's heart pounded rhythmically against her ribs, but it was no longer fueled by panic. She was fueled by the intoxicating thrill of her impending getaway. She truly believed she had successfully executed the perfect crime. In her highly distorted reality, she had successfully looted an empire, discarded a weak husband, and completely outsmarted a multi-million-dollar tycoon. She was merely steps away from trading her impending federal indictment for pristine white sand beaches and endless tropical cocktails. She glanced over at Bradley and offered a smug, triumphant smirk. They approached the first-class priority check-in counter, specifically bypassing the long, winding economy lines, because Meredith always demanded premium treatment, even while actively fleeing federal jurisdiction. She confidently handed her sleek leather passport holder to the neatly dressed airline agent behind the counter. She tapped her acrylic nails rhythmically against the pristine marble surface, practically tasting the salty ocean breeze of her destination. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not spare a single thought for the husband she had coldly abandoned to face the catastrophic ruins of her fraudulent commercial enterprise. She was entirely focused on the glowing departure monitors, convinced that the hardest part of her grand escape was already completely behind her. She envisioned herself lounging in the sun, entirely free from the consequences of her profound cruelty. The cheerful airline agent opened the leather holder and scanned Meredith's passport through the computerized security reader. Instantly, the agent's professional smile faltered. The computer screen flashed a bright, harsh red warning, blocking any further ticketing action. The agent blinked rapidly, staring at the bold text dictating that the passenger was on an active federal no-fly list. Masking her sudden alarm, the agent politely asked for a credit card to cover the international baggage fees, while she subtly pressed a silent emergency alarm button located directly beneath her desk. Meredith scoffed at the minor inconvenience, rolling her eyes dramatically behind her oversized sunglasses. She pulled out her premium platinum credit card and slapped it onto the counter. The agent swiped the magnetic strip. The system immediately returned a hard decline. Frowning, Meredith dug into her designer purse and produced a second card, then a third. Declined. Declined. Your accounts appear to be entirely frozen, ma'am, the agent stated, her voice tight with nervous tension. Please wait just one moment while I contact my supervisor to resolve this issue. The agent picked up the desk phone, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on Meredith. Standing a few feet away, Bradley possessed the hyper-vigilant survival instincts of a career con artist. He watched the agent's forced smile. He saw the glaring red screen reflecting off the polished counter. He recognized the distinct panic in the agent's tight grip on the telephone receiver. He knew exactly what that silent alarm meant. The federal authorities had already locked down her financial network and flagged her travel documents. The trap had officially sprung shut. Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. He did not warn Meredith. He did not offer a comforting word or suggest an alternative escape route. He simply lowered the black canvas duffel bag containing the stolen cash onto the floor right next to her designer suitcase. He took 2 slow, calculated steps backward, distancing himself from the toxic epicenter of her impending downfall. Then he turned around and quickly blended into the thick, chaotic stream of international travelers. He walked away with rapid, purposeful strides, leaving the woman who had funded his lavish lifestyle and destroyed her own marriage to take the catastrophic fall entirely alone. Meredith was far too busy aggressively arguing with the airline agent about her frozen credit limits to notice that her lover had completely vanished. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she shrieked, slamming her fist against the counter. "Run the cards again. There is absolutely no way my accounts are frozen. I am a highly successful entrepreneur. I demand to speak to your manager immediately." She got exactly what she demanded, but it was not an airline manager who answered her. Meredith Callahan, a deep, booming voice echoed from directly behind her, cutting through the loud, ambient noise of the bustling terminal. She spun around, furiously prepared to unleash a torrent of entitled rage. She found herself completely surrounded by 6 heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark tactical vests, with FBI emblazoned in bright yellow letters across their chests. They had moved through the crowd with swift military precision, entirely cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The lead agent stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute unyielding authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and grand larceny," the agent declared, his voice projecting clearly across the entire check-in area. "Put your hands behind your back immediately." Meredith froze. The oversized sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose, revealing eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked around frantically for Bradley, only to find empty space where her supposed partner in crime had stood just seconds before. The sheer reality of her utter abandonment crashed into her simultaneously, with the heavy metal handcuffs snapping violently shut around her wrists. The cold steel locked tightly, securely binding the hands that had forged my signature. The bustling international terminal came to a grinding halt. Hundreds of affluent travelers stopped dragging their luggage to stare at the unfolding spectacle. Dozens of smartphone cameras were instantly raised high into the air, recording every single humiliating second of her downfall in high definition. The woman who had built her entire identity on a carefully manufactured facade of flawless high society luxury was now being publicly paraded through a crowded airport like a common street criminal. She sobbed hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, begging the stoic federal agents to listen to her fabricated excuses. They completely ignored her pleas, marching her aggressively past the massive crowds of whispering, pointing spectators. Her ultimate humiliation was absolute broadcast live to the very same digital world she had used to parade her stolen wealth. The very next morning, the swift, brutal hammer of public justice struck the final blow. I sat in the quiet luxury of the presidential suite, sipping my dark roast coffee as the morning sun illuminated the city skyline. Jonathan Hayes walked into the room, holding a freshly printed copy of the city's most prominent daily newspaper. He did not say a word. He simply placed the broadsheet down on the mahogany dining table right next to my coffee cup. The front page featured a massive, high-resolution photograph taken by a bystander at the international terminal. It captured Meredith perfectly. Her designer clothes were disheveled, her face was contorted in a pathetic wail of supreme panic, and her wrists were bound tightly in heavy federal handcuffs as armed agents flanked her on all sides. The bold black headline above the photograph read, "Luxury spa owner arrested in million-dollar fraud scheme." The entire city now knew exactly who she really was. Her perfectly curated digital empire was reduced to a criminal mugshot for the world to scrutinize and mock. But my work was not quite finished. I had to clean up the emotional wreckage she left behind, and finally address the fractured relationship with the son sitting silently in the adjoining room. The federal courthouse was a massive, imposing fortress of polished granite and cold, unforgiving justice. I sat in the very front row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, projecting the quiet, unyielding authority of a man who had successfully protected his empire and his blood. The heavy wooden double doors at the side of the courtroom clicked open, and two armed federal marshals led Meredith into the room. The collective gasp from the few remaining members of her family seated in the back was clearly audible. The arrogant high society woman who had viciously demanded my retirement password while throwing my luggage into the freezing rain was entirely gone. In her place stood a hollow, thoroughly defeated shell of a human being. She was wearing a baggy, bright orange federal prison jumpsuit that completely swallowed her shrinking frame. Her wrists were securely shackled to a heavy metal chain wrapped tightly around her waist, restricting her movements to a pathetic shuffle. The thick layers of expensive designer makeup and the perfectly styled hair that once defined her toxic digital persona were completely stripped away. Her dark roots were showing harshly against her bleached hair. Her skin was incredibly pale, and deep purple bags dragged down her eyes from countless sleepless nights in a concrete holding cell. She shuffled toward the defense table, her head hanging low, physically weighed down by the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic ruin she had brought upon herself. She did not dare to look back at the gallery. She did not dare to look at me. The vibrant, undeniable arrogance that had fueled her relentless cruelty was entirely extinguished, replaced only by the raw, pathetic terror of a predator caught firmly in a trap. The federal judge, a stern, imposing woman with absolutely zero tolerance for financial predators, called the courtroom to order. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating as the lead federal prosecutor began outlining the meticulous, highly calculated nature of Meredith's crimes. She painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a woman driven by pure, unadulterated greed, willing to completely destroy a vulnerable elder to fund a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Facing an absolute mountain of undeniable forensic evidence, Meredith's defense attorney, a desperate public defender named Harrison, had only one viable strategy left in his legal arsenal. He attempted to execute the exact same ruthless plan Meredith had bragged about in her secret motel room recording. He tried to dump the entire catastrophic weight of the federal indictment squarely onto the shoulders of my son. Harrison paced aggressively in front of the jury box, dramatically pointing his finger at Kendrick, who sat silently at a separate table. The defense spun a highly fictionalized and deeply insulting narrative, portraying Meredith as a naive, trusting wife who was simply following the complex financial directives of her supposedly domineering husband. Harrison argued that Kendrick, being my biological son, was the only person with the intimate historical knowledge required to successfully forge my signature and bypass the strict security protocols of my primary banking institution. He loudly claimed Meredith was completely innocent and entirely manipulated by Kendrick to take the absolute fall for his own financial greed. It was a vicious, calculated legal strike designed to trigger reasonable doubt by actively sacrificing my son's freedom to save her own skin. But I had already anticipated this exact cowardly maneuver the very moment I watched that hidden surveillance footage in my office. I had not abandoned my son to face this legal slaughterhouse alone. Sitting directly beside Kendrick was a formidable phalanx of the most ruthless and expensive criminal defense attorneys money could buy. entirely funded by my private trust. They immediately and aggressively dismantled Harrison's pathetic narrative. My elite legal team systematically presented the high-definition bank security footage, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Meredith executed the wire transfer entirely alone. They submitted the exhaustive forensic handwriting analysis that definitively matched the forged signature to Meredith's precise penmanship. Most importantly, they introduced the heavily encrypted financial routing data that explicitly proved the stolen funds were actively funneled directly into the offshore accounts of Bradley Lawson, her secret romantic partner. My attorneys made it absolutely and undeniably clear to the judge and the jury that Kendrick was not the mastermind of this federal fraud. He was simply another tragic victim of Meredith's profound and highly calculated psychological abuse. The defining moment of the entire trial arrived when the federal prosecutor officially called Kendrick to the witness stand. My son walked slowly across the silent courtroom, his footsteps echoing heavily against the polished wood floor. He took the solemn oath and sat down facing the jury box. He looked completely different from the broken, terrified man who had collapsed in my executive office weeks ago, begging for a bailout. The thick, heavy fog of manipulation had finally cleared from his eyes, leaving behind a sharp, profound clarity born from absolute heartbreak. The prosecutor gently guided him through the harrowing timeline of his toxic marriage. Kendrick did not hold back a single detail. He spoke with a quiet, devastating honesty that captivated the entire courtroom. He explicitly detailed how Meredith had systematically isolated him from his family, manipulating his deep personal insecurities to gain absolute control over his financial decisions. He testified about the relentless psychological abuse, the constant toxic belittling, and the specific aggressive ultimatum she issued, demanding he secure massive capital for her luxury spa by any means necessary. But the most damning testimony came when the prosecutor asked him to recount the day she threw me out of the house. Kendrick looked directly at Meredith, his voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of the fear that used to bind him. He told the jury exactly how she had viciously demanded my passwords, how she had mocked my worn clothes, and how she had actively planned to leave him to rot with the massive commercial debt while she fled the country with her lover. He testified under penalty of perjury that he was entirely unaware she had already stolen the $200,000 until the federal agents officially informed him of the transaction. Meredith sat completely frozen at the defense table, her pale face contorted in pure agony as she watched the man she had completely underestimated firmly shut the final door on her freedom. Kendrick's devastating testimony dismantled her remaining defenses piece by piece, exposing the cold, calculating predator hiding beneath her designer clothes. It was the absolute final, undeniable nail in her metaphorical coffin. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning to the silent courtroom with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all federal counts, including aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and massive wire fraud. The judge sternly instructed Meredith to stand for her official sentencing. She struggled heavily to her feet, her legs trembling so violently the federal marshals had to physically support her arms to keep her upright. The judge looked down from the high mahogany bench, her expression radiating absolute judicial contempt. You actively preyed upon an elderly family member, exploiting their profound trust to fuel your own shallow, toxic vanity, the judge declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. You demonstrated zero remorse and actively attempted to destroy your own husband to escape the severe consequences of your immense greed. Society must be fiercely protected from this profound level of manipulation. The judge raised her heavy wooden gavel high into the quiet, tense air of the courtroom. I hereby sentence you to 7 years in federal prison with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The heavy gavel slammed down violently onto the sound block, sealing her absolute fate, as Meredith's agonizing, terrified screams echoed sharply through the cold granite halls. I pushed the heavy brass key into the front door of the suburban house and turned the lock. The deadbolt clicked with a sharp, echoing finality. I stepped over the threshold into a space that felt entirely different from the toxic battleground it had been just weeks ago. The house was completely and utterly silent. The pretentious air of manufactured high society that Meredith had aggressively pumped into every single room was completely gone. The sprawling living room that had once been staged for a high-end real estate open house was now stripped down to the bare wooden floorboards. The federal authorities and the aggressive commercial repo men had meticulously seized every single piece of luxury furniture, every imported crystal vase, and every expensive piece of modern art Meredith had purchased to mask her profound inner emptiness. They had carried out the plush velvet sofas and the massive flat-screen televisions, leaving behind nothing but the faint rectangular indentations on the pristine carpets where her fraudulent empire used to sit. I walked slowly through the empty rooms, my heavy leather work boots echoing loudly against the bare walls. The profound quiet of the house was not oppressive, it was deeply cleansing. It felt as though a thick, suffocating layer of toxic smoke had finally been vented out through the open windows, allowing the structure to breathe again. I walked past the empty dining room and stopped in the small corner of the living space. My heart warmed with a deep, quiet comfort. The small, beautifully crafted wooden altar I had built for my late wife Gwendolyn remained exactly where I had placed it. The federal agents had respectfully left it completely untouched. Her silver locket and our faded wedding photograph sat proudly in the center, completely outlasting the shallow, temporary luxury that had briefly surrounded them. True value always outlives cheap imitation. I reached out and gently traced the edge of the wooden frame, feeling Gwen's steady, protective presence, filling the hollow spaces of the home I had bought with my own two hands. A soft shuffling sound broke the absolute silence coming from the master bedroom at the top of the stairs. I walked carefully up the carpeted steps and stood in the open doorway. Kendrick was inside, kneeling on the floor next to a faded canvas duffel bag. The massive walk-in closet that Meredith used to fill with stolen designer dresses and luxury handbags was completely empty. Kendrick was methodically folding his plain cotton shirts and basic denim jeans, packing the absolute bare minimum he needed to survive. He did not have the arrogant posture of a suburban homeowner anymore. His shoulders were heavily slumped, and his hands moved with the slow, mechanical precision of a man who had completely lost his entire sense of direction. He looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. The sheer magnitude of his profound shame was physically agonizing to witness. He did not puff out his chest. He did not try to manufacture a pathetic excuse for his massive failures. He simply lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze for more than a fraction of a second. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew he had stood silently by while his wife threw me out into a freezing rainstorm, demanding my life savings. He knew he had traded his father's unconditional love for a toxic illusion that ultimately left him completely destitute. He zipped up the heavy canvas bag and stood up slowly. He did not dare to ask for my forgiveness. He knew that cheap apologies offered in the direct aftermath of a catastrophic defeat held absolutely no real value. Most importantly, he did not dare to ask me if he could stay in the house. He fully understood that his name on the property deed was completely neutralized by the ironclad life estate I controlled. He had absolutely zero legal or moral right to remain under this roof. He picked up the heavy duffel bag and slung the canvas strap over his shoulder. The weight of his packed belongings was nothing compared to the crushing emotional weight he was currently carrying. He took a hesitant step toward the hallway, bracing himself for the harsh, unforgiving reality of the world waiting for him outside those front doors. He was a man stripped entirely of his ego, his fake wealth, and his toxic marriage, forced to finally face the devastating consequences of his own cowardice. Kendrick walked slowly down the stairs, his heavy footsteps matching the slow rhythm of my own heartbeat. He reached the bottom landing and stopped just a few feet away from the heavy wooden front door. He gripped the strap of his canvas bag so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth, struggling to formulate a sentence, trying to find the exact words to express the monumental regret suffocating his chest. I did not let him speak. I raised my hand, calling for absolute silence. The time for empty words had long passed. I looked my son directly in the eyes, projecting the stern, unyielding authority of a father who refused to let his child remain weak. "Kendrick," I said, my voice echoing with a deep, powerful resonance through the empty foyer. "You made choices that nearly destroyed this family. You allowed a predator into your home, and you handed her the weapon to strike down the very man who gave you life. You chose the comfortable illusion of compliance over the difficult reality of standing up for what is right." Kendrick squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down his cheek. I did not offer him a comforting embrace. I did not offer him a warm place to sleep. My money is not a life preserver for your profound cowardice, I stated coldly, making sure every single word embedded itself deep into his mind. I will not write a check to shield you from the harsh elements of the real world. That kind of unearned rescue is exactly what made you so dangerously weak in the first place. You forgot the value of hard work. You forgot the calluses on my hands that built the foundation you so casually threw away. If you want to understand what it truly means to be a man, you have to build your life completely from scratch. You have to feel the burn of manual labor, the ache of your muscles, and the heavy exhaustion that comes from earning an honest, uncorrupted dollar. You have to lay your own bricks. Nobody is going to carry you anymore. Kendrick slowly opened his eyes. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a tiny flicker of genuine understanding finally sparked. He gave a slow, definitive nod, accepting the absolute truth of my judgment. "You are absolutely right, Dad," he whispered, his voice raw, but entirely devoid of his previous pathetic whining. "I have to earn my own way. I have to fix myself." He turned around and reached for the brass handle of the heavy front door. He pulled it open, stepping out onto the concrete porch where my wet suitcase had been violently tossed just weeks prior. He was not heading to a comfortable office job or a luxury spa. He was heading straight to a local commercial construction site, having secured a minimum wage position hauling heavy concrete blocks and digging trenches in the blistering sun. He was actively choosing the grueling manual labor he and his arrogant wife had once looked down upon with supreme disgust. I watched him walk down the long driveway, the heavy canvas bag bouncing against his hip. I did not call out to him. I did not wave goodbye. I firmly pushed the heavy wooden door shut and locked the deadbolt with a sharp, satisfying click, securing my home and entirely closing this dark chapter. Several months passed since I locked the heavy front door of that suburban house. I had initially planned to stay there to preserve the memories, but the quiet, empty rooms eventually reminded me too much of the toxic battle I had fought. I decided to list the property on the competitive market and sold it to a hard-working young couple, eager to start their own life. It was time for me to physically step into the reality of the wealth I had built. I instructed Jonathan to finalize the rapid purchase of a sprawling modern penthouse, occupying the entire top floor of a premier luxury high-rise in the heart of the financial district. The moment I stepped out of the private elevator, directly into my new foyer, I felt a profound sense of absolute elevation. The penthouse featured massive, wraparound glass windows, offering a completely unobstructed 360-degree view of the sprawling city skyline. The floors were polished dark oak, and the furniture was custom crafted, combining sleek modern design with warm, rich leather. I took the small wooden altar dedicated to Gwendolyn and placed it in the absolute center of the main living space, right where the morning sun would hit it first. I no longer lived in a damp, cold basement, hiding my existence to coddle the fragile egos of an ungrateful younger generation. The transition was not just physical, it was a profound, psychological shift. For decades, I had actively downplayed my intelligence and my financial prowess to survive in a society that often viewed a successful black man as a direct threat. I had hidden my massive corporate portfolio behind the calloused hands of a retired tradesman. Moving into this magnificent penthouse was my formal declaration of complete independence. I no longer needed to pretend. I no longer needed to shrink myself to fit into a narrative constructed by people who fundamentally underestimated me. I poured myself a glass of expensive aged bourbon and raised it toward the glittering city lights. This was my kingdom, built on a foundation of absolute truth and relentless hard work. I hired a private chef and a housekeeper, allowing myself to actually enjoy the fruits of my grueling labor. The air up here was clean and entirely free of manipulation. I had finally claimed my rightful place. But enjoying my wealth in silent isolation was never my ultimate goal. The horrific ordeal with Meredith had violently opened my eyes to a devastating reality. If a highly educated multimillionaire like myself could be aggressively targeted and nearly stripped of his civil rights by a greedy relative, what was happening to the vulnerable elderly folks who did not have elite lawyers or hidden offshore trusts? I thought of the countless older black men and women in my community who had worked their entire lives, only to have their modest pensions stolen by entitled children or predatory scammers. I picked up my phone and summoned Jonathan to the penthouse for a major structural meeting. I instructed him to instantly liquidate $10 million from my primary investment holding. Jonathan did not blink, simply asking where I wanted to deploy the capital. I told him to establish a comprehensive non-profit legal defense fund. We named it the Gwendolyn and Wade Foundation. Our absolute singular mission was to provide elite free legal representation to elderly individuals facing financial abuse, exploitation, or fraudulent guardianship petitions. I hired top-tier litigators, aggressive forensic accountants, and compassionate social workers to form a relentless protective shield around the most vulnerable members of our society. Within weeks of launching, our specialized teams were actively intervening in local courtrooms, entirely dismantling predatory legal claims, and actively returning stolen assets to rightful owners. We set up hotlines and community outreach programs, ensuring that no senior citizen would ever have to stand alone against a greedy family member or a corporate predator. I personally reviewed the case files, reading the tragic stories of elders who had been tossed aside, exactly like I was. But unlike my situation, they did not have the means to fight back. Now they had a $10 million war chest and a team of legal sharks actively fighting on their behalf. Gwen would have been incredibly proud. She always believed that true power was not measured by what you kept for yourself, but by how fiercely you protected those who could not protect themselves. The foundation became my ultimate weapon, turning my personal family tragedy into a massive shield for my community. Despite the massive success of the foundation and the sheer luxury of my new life, I could not completely ignore the profound silence that echoed through the massive penthouse late at night. The victory was absolute and undeniable, but it came with a heavy, agonizing price. I had successfully protected my empire and sent a dangerous predator to federal prison, but I had also lost the only family I had left. There were evenings when I would sit in my leather armchair, staring out at the glowing city lights, feeling a sharp, undeniable pang of profound loneliness. I missed the son I thought I had raised. I missed the simple illusion of family dinners, and the comforting lie that I would be surrounded by loved ones in my final years. The massive dining table in my penthouse sat completely empty, a stark reminder of the devastating, necessary war I had waged. I allowed myself to feel that grief. I did not hide from the pain of a fractured family, but I also absolutely refused to let that loneliness morph into toxic regret. I knew with absolute certainty that keeping the illusion alive would have been a fatal mistake. Meredith was a vicious, malignant tumor, aggressively feeding on our family, and Kendrick had become the weak, compromised tissue, allowing her to spread. You cannot negotiate with a tumor. You cannot simply ignore a rot that threatens your very survival. You have to take a sharp scalpel and cut it out entirely, regardless of how much it hurts to lose a piece of yourself in the process. The excruciating pain of the surgery is simply the necessary price of long-term survival. I had aggressively cut the rot out of my life before it could completely consume me. The silence in my penthouse was occasionally lonely, but it was incredibly peaceful. It was entirely free of gaslighting manipulation and the suffocating anxiety of walking on eggshells around people who secretly despised me. I traded a toxic, manufactured family for absolute dignity and unyielding peace of mind. And given the exact same choice, I would pick up my suitcase and walk out into that freezing rain 1,000 times over. The profound impact of the foundation could not remain a secret forever. Several months after our launch, a prominent national newspaper published a massive investigative feature on the sudden drop in elder financial abuse cases in our state. The front-page headline did not feature a mugshot of a disgraced spa owner. Instead, it boldly declared, "The Silent Guardian, Protecting Our Elders," featuring a detailed breakdown of the Gwendolyn and Wade Foundation. The journalist had uncovered my identity, praising the anonymous retired tradesman who had deployed a massive secret fortune to fight for justice. I did not give them an interview, preferring to let the undeniable results speak for themselves. The article completely cemented my new legacy, transforming my darkest hour into a beacon of absolute triumph. The seasons changed, and the chaotic storm of the past slowly faded into a steady, powerful calm. Exactly 1 full year passed since the day I locked the door of that suburban house. Exactly 1 year later, I found myself sitting in the plush leather back seat of my Lincoln Town car, heading back to the city after attending a foundation event in the northern suburbs. The route took us directly past the high-security state correctional facility, where Meredith was currently serving her 7-year sentence. I instructed my driver to slow down as we approached the sprawling compound. The prison was a bleak, desolate fortress of gray concrete and heavy razor wire sitting starkly against the barren landscape. It was the absolute antithesis of the luxurious, marble-floored, high-society life Meredith had so ruthlessly tried to steal. I rolled down the tinted window, letting the cool afternoon air fill the cabin, and simply looked at the massive steel gates. I knew Meredith was inside those walls, wearing an identical baggy orange jumpsuit, stripped of her designer labels, her fake friends, and her toxic arrogance. I did not ask the driver to pull into the visitor parking lot. I had absolutely no desire to sit behind a thick pane of reinforced glass and listen to her inevitable fabricated apologies or desperate pleas for early release. Seeing her in a cage would not bring me any additional satisfaction, because my victory was never about petty gloating. It was about permanently removing a highly dangerous predator from my family and ensuring she faced the absolute maximum penalty for her profound greed. I looked at the towering concrete walls one last time, and a quiet, peaceful smile touched my lips. The universe has a remarkably efficient way of balancing the scales. She had looked at a retired black man and seen nothing but a useless obstacle to be discarded. Now she was the one locked away, and entirely forgotten by the world she sacrificed everything to impress. I rolled the window back up, shutting out the harsh reality of the prison yard, and told my driver to take me home. The chapter of Meredith Callahan was officially and permanently closed. When the private elevator doors opened into the foyer of my penthouse, I was greeted by an unexpected but deeply welcome sight. Kendrick was standing in the center of the massive living room, looking out over the city. The physical transformation of my son over the past 12 months was absolutely staggering. He was no longer wearing the overly trendy, expensive clothes Meredith used to force him to buy to fit her shallow aesthetic. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket, faded denim jeans, and thick steel-toed boots coated in a fine layer of gray concrete dust. He did not look out of place among my luxury furniture. He looked completely grounded. As I walked toward him, he turned around, reached out, and firmly shook my hand. I immediately felt the thick, rough calluses covering his palms and fingers. They were the unmistakable badges of honor earned through grueling, relentless manual labor. But the most profound change was in his eyes. The terrified, cowardly gaze that used to constantly dart toward the floor was completely gone. He stood with his shoulders squared, looking me directly in the eyes, with a calm, undeniable confidence that he had never possessed before. "Dad," he said, his voice steady and proud, "I wanted to come over and tell you in person. The site director pulled me into the construction trailer this morning. They promoted me to senior project manager. I am going to be running the entire downtown commercial development site starting next week." A deep, overwhelming sense of pride swelled inside my chest. This was not a promotion handed to him by a wealthy father, or manipulated through a toxic network of fake friends. He had spent the last year hauling cinder blocks, pouring concrete in the blistering heat, and proving his absolute worth through sheer, undeniable grit. He had completely rebuilt his entire identity from the ground up, brick by grueling brick. I pulled him into a strong embrace, feeling the solid, hard muscle he had built over the past year. "I am incredibly proud of you, Kendrick," I told him, stepping back and looking at the man he had finally become. "You earned every single piece of this victory. You did it the right way, without any shortcuts." We moved to the large mahogany dining table and sat down together. My housekeeper brought out 2 steaming mugs of dark roast coffee, the exact same way we used to drink it in the old days, before the crushing weight of his toxic marriage tore us apart. We sat in the warm sunlight filtering through the panoramic windows, completely free from the suffocating tension that used to define our interactions. There were no lies between us anymore. There was no fake superiority, no hidden agendas, and absolutely no walking on eggshells. We were just 2 men who had survived a massive, devastating storm and come out the other side fundamentally stronger. Kendrick took a slow sip of his coffee and looked out over the sprawling city skyline, taking in the peaceful atmosphere. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, setting his mug down on the table, "the hardest part of this entire year was realizing how incredibly blind I was. Meredith treated you like you were entirely invisible. She treated you like you were slow and uneducated just because you chose to live quietly and wear old clothes. And I was foolish enough to let her do it. I set my coffee mug down on the polished wood and leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the table. That is the greatest mistake arrogant people make in this world. I explained my voice, resonating with decades of hard-earned wisdom. They fundamentally misunderstand the true nature of silence. The silence of an older person is never ignorance, Kendrick. It is never weakness. When we sit quietly and let people disrespect us, it is not because we do not understand what they are doing. We are observing. We are calculating. We are silently gathering every single piece of information we need to accurately evaluate exactly who you are. Meredith thought my silence meant I was a helpless old fool she could easily conquer. She confused my extreme patience with stupidity. But true power does not need to scream to be heard. True power sits quietly in the background, holding all the keys, allowing a predator to comfortably build their own cage before firmly locking the door from the outside. Kendrick nodded slowly, fully absorbing the absolute truth of my words. He finally understood that the quiet, unassuming man he had nearly sacrificed was actually a sleeping giant who only woke up when the very survival of his family was critically threatened. I stood up from the table and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the bustling city below. I had built a massive financial empire, survived the darkest depths of systemic discrimination, and successfully protected my legacy from a highly calculated predator. I had successfully returned my son to the path of honest, hard work, and I was using my immense wealth to fiercely shield the most vulnerable members of my community. I looked at the small wooden altar dedicated to Gwendolyn, resting peacefully in the sunlight, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had fulfilled my final promise to her. I took a deep breath of the clean, quiet air of my penthouse. I do not regret walking out of that door that day. I do not regret letting the cold rain hit my face or watching my suitcase sink into the mud. It was the necessary catalyst for the greatest cleansing my family ever experienced. Thank you so much for listening to my story. What would you have done if your daughter-in-law handed you that ultimate ultimatum? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and do not forget to tell me what city you are watching from. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and always protect your peace. Looking back at the wreckage and the rebuilding of our lives, the final lesson I carry with me is about the true nature of love. We are often taught that loving our family means shielding them from every hardship and constantly opening our wallets to cushion their falls. But true love is not about being a perpetual safety net for someone else's toxic mistakes. Sometimes the most profound act of love a father can perform is stepping aside and allowing his child to feel the crushing weight of their own consequences. It is only in the cold rubble of their absolute failures that they can find the necessary strength to rebuild themselves into people of actual substance. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs a firm reminder to never mistake quiet kindness for weakness.